Hi, I'm Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, the Director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Welcome back to our video series on competition with China. In this video, we're going to be discussing the events leading up to the 4th of June, 1989, which is usually referred to as the Tiananmen Square Crisis. We're very lucky to have with us a true expert and someone who was actually on the ground during the events in 1989. Mr. Ken Allen is a retired U.S. Air Force Major and was then the Assistant Air Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing during 1987 to 1989. He's going to describe the events of the spring of 1999, what the Defense Attaché Office was doing at the time. And so, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ken Allen.
As an Air Force captain, I served as an Assistant Air Attaché in the U.S. Defense Attaché Office, or AKDAO, in Beijing from 15 April 1987 to 20 June 89. I was only the third Assistant Air Attaché in Beijing since the U.S. established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, or PRC, in 1979. In January 1988, the U.S. Air Force added a second Assistant Air Attaché, Captain Danny Lever, as a result of the growing military relationship with China. I was originally scheduled to leave in April 1989 at the end of my two-year tour. However, my successor, Major Kevin Lancet, had a daughter in school and did not want to pull her out of school early. My sons were only 3 and 5 years old in '89. Therefore, we agreed to delay his arrival and my departure till mid-June. Today, I'd like to provide a personal view of what I was involved in on the ground with Major Lonnie Keene, who was one of the 2 Assistant Army Attachés, or AARMA, during the Tiananmen crisis from early May to mid-June 1989. The briefing only touches on the larger political issues surrounding the crisis. During the night of 3 to 4 June 89, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, took over Tiananmen Square, killed thousands of demonstrators along the way who had gathered since early May. Major Keene and I were in western Beijing and observed hundreds of PLA vehicles heading toward Tiananmen Square at 0400 on the morning of the 4th, which I will discuss in detail in a few minutes. Based on discussions in early 2021 with a U.S. government analyst who was involved in assessing the situation at the time, I was told that the terms the U.S. government has used have varied depending on the situation. Specifically, the default became Tiananmen Crisis for the overall period during May and June, but individuals never shied away from using massacre during private conversations for the events on 3 to 4 June. The U.S. government never used the term incident because that was what the term the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, used. This briefing uses crisis and event, but it also uses massacre for one specific situation. A search of Amazon shows over 50 books that deal with the crisis and its aftermath. Many of the books use the term massacre in the title. The single book I used as the primary source was Timothy Brooks' Quelling the People, The Military Suppression of the Beijing Democracy Movement, which was published in 1998. The August 1999 issue of PLA Pictorial, which you can see I still have a copy of today. Although we live in a technology-oriented world today, it was not like that in 1989. There were no digital cameras, no GPS. We had to carry film with us, which came in rolls of 12, 24, or 36 pictures. But we also had to be prepared to pull out the film and destroy it if we got stopped by the military or police. After taking the photos, we had them developed at the DAO office by one of the enlisted support personnel, or sent them directly back to the Defense Intelligence Agency, i.e. DIA, to be developed. At that time, DAO Beijing had 2 embassy vehicles assigned to it with embassy license plates. One was the Defense Attachés, or DAT, and one was available to the remaining 7 attachés as needed. Each car had a Chinese driver who was responsible for filling up the car with gas at the end of each day, but they did not always do that. We were also allowed to drive the vehicle on the weekend or during the day if we wanted to. When I arrived in Beijing, there were no computers. We had to use a typewriter to type each of our reports and then have them faxed to DI. During the second year, we received a Wang computer in the skiff, but it was very limited in what we could do. Each attaché also had to had their own personal vehicle with embassy license plates. There were very few gas stations, all of which shut down during the crisis in early June. In the late 1980s, DAO Beijing was quite busy. Each attaché was escorting an average of 1 delegation per month. The photo shown here is from the summer of 1988 and is the only photo that was taken in my 2 years of all the attachés in the office at the same time. I learned early on how to get around Beijing. When I arrived, then A-Arma Major John Corbett, who arrived in Beijing in April '86, and I traveled around Beijing in the DAO vehicle at least once a week to find military facilities. I drove and he navigated. We observed military vehicles and charted locations on a map of Beijing, which I still have today. When he left in April of '88, I continued to drive around Beijing by myself in my DAO vehicle or my personal Honda at least once a week, so that by the time Tiananmen rolled around, I knew Beijing like the back of my hand, to include where almost every military installation was. Needless to say, Beijing is much more complicated today. Here you see a picture of me and my coup bag. I learned that term from one of my classmates in the attaché school in early '87 before I went to Beijing. He had been stationed in Thailand as an assistant attaché. He told me that he never left the office without a bag because there might be a coup and you might not be able to return to the office for a while. Concerning cash, I carried about $200 US dollars worth of Chinese renminbi with me. At that time, all foreigners had to use what was called Waihui, which was a version of renminbi that all foreigners had to use. We had to exchange US dollars for the Waihui at a nearby friendship store, which was an international store. There were no ATMs or credit cards at that time. There were several major events that took place from mid-April to June 4th. Of note, Ambassador Winston Lord left Beijing in April and was replaced on May 1st by James Lilly, who previously served as the head of the CIA office in Beijing, a senior officer in the National Security Council, director of the American Institute in Taiwan, and ambassador to South Korea. Everyone knew in early April that students from the key universities in Beijing, including Peking University and Tsinghua University, would be marching on May 4th in order to celebrate the 70th anniversary of their protest concerning the May 4th, 1919 Treaty of Versailles discussed below. The May 4th movement was an anti-imperialist cultural and political movement growing out of student participants in Beijing on May 4th, 1919, protesting against the Chinese government's weak response to the Treaty of Versailles, especially allowing Japan to receive territories in Shandong, which had been surrendered by Germany after the siege of Qingdao. These demonstrations sparked national protests and marked the upsurge of Chinese nationalism, a shift towards political mobilization and away from cultural activities, and a move towards a populist base rather than intellectual elites. Many political and social leaders of the next decades emerged at that time. Although everyone expected the demonstrations to last for a day and the students would go back to their campuses, several things impacted the overall situation. Most importantly, on April 15th, Hu Yaobang, who had served as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party from '82 to '87, died, and the students who had felt that Hu had tried to open up China took to the streets earlier than expected for the May 4th demonstrations. After Deng Xiaoping rose to power following the death of Mao Zedong in '76, he was promoted to a series of high political positions. Throughout the '80s, Hu pursued a series of economic and political reforms under the direction of Deng. Hu's political and economic reforms made him the enemy of several powerful political elders who opposed free market reforms and attempts to make China's government more transparent. When widespread student protests occurred across China in '87, Hu's political opponents successfully blamed him for the disruption, claiming that Hu's laxness and bourgeois liberalization had either led to or worsened the protests. Hu was forced to resign as party general secretary in '87, but was allowed to retain a seat in the Politburo. Although everyone expected the students to return to their campuses after the May 4th demonstration, two other key events led students to remain on the streets. It is important to note here that the demonstrations were led by students, but they also involved workers from around the city. First, the Asian Development Bank held a meeting in Beijing in mid-May, and a female representative from Taiwan represented Taiwan. Second, the Secretary General of the Soviet Union's Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, arrived in Beijing on May 15th, where he met with Deng Xiaoping. On May 18th, 1 million demonstrators, including students and workers, took to the streets for a demonstration and basically shut down the city. On his last day, Gorbachev visited Shanghai, where demonstrators were also taking place. From May 13 to 19 May, students led by Wu Kai-shi held a hunger strike in Beijing. On May 17th, the U.S. Embassy issued a warning notice to American citizens in China concerning the overall situation and encouraged caution. At that time, there was not an overwhelming number of Americans in China, and it was difficult communicating with them. Of note, demonstrations were also taking place in the multiple other cities, including Shanghai, but there was not a military crackdown as there was in Beijing. During my 26 months in Beijing, the U.S. had fairly good military relations with the PRC. As such, I averaged escorting one delegation per month, and I wrote several hundred reports as a result. This slide shows the key events that took place or were planned to take place during April and May. There were three key events concerning the USAF during 1989 leading up to the event. First, the USAF and the PLA Air Force had a $550 million foreign military sales FMS program known as Peace Parole for the Grumman Corporation to produce a fire control system for the J-82 fighter, which was the only U.S. FMS program out of 4 cases. The Army had 2 and the Navy had 1 as well. In January '89, a USAF C-5 flew 2 J-82s from the Shenyang Aircraft Factory to a newly built Grumman facility in Bethpage, New York, where the work was going to be done. The photo at the right shows the aircraft being loaded onto the C-5. In addition, 2 USAF lieutenant colonels were deployed to China in May for a 2-year tour to help manage the overall program. They lived in a newly created PLA Air Force facility near the Great Wall. Second, in April, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Larry Welch, led a delegation for a visit to China for about 1 week, including visits to operational units and various headquarters. Third, in May, a joint USAF and FAA delegation visited Beijing to discuss air traffic control issues. During a visit to the Beijing International Airport Control Tower, we got information about Gorbachev's entire itinerary, including the flight route, aircraft types, aircraft tail number, and call signs, etc. I passed that information on. Every 6 months, the PLA took all of the 4 military attachés who were part of the Beijing Military Attaché Corps, or BMAC, on a visit to some military facilities outside Beijing. During my first year, we visited the starting point of the Long March in 1934 in Jiangxi Province. During my second year, we visited Harbin, Heilongjiang in January to see the Ice Festival, visit the Heilongjiang Military District Headquarters. And in mid-1988, all of the foreign Air Force attachés visited PLA Air Force facilities in Changchun, Jilin Province. Although BMAC visited Tianjin in May 1989, I did not get to attend because I was escorting the USAF and FAA delegation in Beijing. TAO's Army officers had been planning for a visit by the Chief of Staff of the Army for June, but that trip got canceled due to Tiananmen. 3 U.S. Navy ships, including the Blue Ridge, which was the command ship of the 7th Fleet, plus 2 guided missile destroyers, visited Shanghai from 19 to 20 May, which was the first visit by any U.S. Navy ships to Shanghai. This was taking place at the same time that Gorbachev visited Shanghai. Our naval attaché, Captain Vance Morrison, and his wife Libby were in Shanghai to help support the visit. Unfortunately, after dropping off the 7th Fleet commander at the airport, their taxi turned a corner and ran into the back of a dump truck that had been stopped due to the demonstrations. Libby broke several bones. They were both flown out of Shanghai by U.S. Navy aircraft to the Philippines and then to Hawaii. Vance returned to Beijing just before June 4th. He and I arrived in Beijing at the same time in '87, and he was also preparing to leave at the end of his 2-year assignment. His replacement, Captain James Holmes, arrived on June 2nd. On the morning of May 4th, Ambassador Lilly tasked Major Keane, shown at the top left-hand photo in the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square, and me to gather as much information as we could about the demonstration that day and then report to him that evening. As such, we traveled around Tiananmen Square, around Peking University, Tsinghua University, and up and down Chang'an-Jie and took several hundred photos, which you can see here. Keep in mind that the weather in Beijing in May and June was in the 80s. Upon returning to DAO, we had one of the enlisted support personnel develop the film so we could show the photo to Ambassador Lilly that evening. The demonstrations continued. The weather was very hot. Overall, the atmosphere was very, what we call, festive. Although the students began a hunger strike, one of the key student leaders, Wu Kai-shi, was found eating in a local restaurant. While the DAT did not venture out of the office, he tasked each of the other attachés to monitor what was happening on the streets. Lonnie and I drove around different parts of Beijing. At midnight around May 10th, we came across a huge group of demonstrators several blocks from the U.S. Embassy who had blocked a Peel Air Force surface-air missile on the back of a truck that was being driven to a maintenance facility outside Beijing. As soon as the demonstrators saw us, because we stuck out with our embassy vehicle, they called us over and explained to us what we were seeing. They showed us all of the various production serial numbers on the SAM, and we wrote everything down and reported it later that night. Another night, we found a large group of demonstrators standing outside a group of military personnel. We were standing between them when they suddenly began throwing rocks at each other. We booked out of there as quickly as we could. Each day, we returned to the office and wrote up what we had seen during the day and submitted it in a report. Around May 10th, in order to have some continuity, the DAT tasked each of us to monitor activities in a certain part of the city or area of responsibility. He tasked Lonnie and me to monitor any activity that was taking place in western Beijing, which included various universities and factories. This map shows the location where we found hundreds of troops parked in two separate locations in the western suburbs outside what's called the Fifth Ring Road. This was around May 18th. It also shows where Tiananmen Square and the U.S. Embassy are located. On Saturday, May 20th, was a very tense day. At some point during the day, Premier Li Peng declared martial law and ordered the demonstrators to evacuate the streets. Of particular importance, according to Article 89 of the Constitution, full martial law can only be implemented by authority of the National People's Congress, or NPC. The State Council, which directs the day-to-day work of the NPC under the Premier, can, however, impose martial law without consulting the NPC. By placing only 8 of the 16 districts that compose Beijing under martial law, Premier Li Peng could get what he wanted without consulting the NPC. Had the government chosen to impose martial law over the entire 16 districts, it would have had to go through the NPC, which, given the popular sentiment at the time, would have been politically awkward. The biggest problem with this was that the chairman of the NPC, Wan Li, was on a formal visit to Canada and the U.S. from 15 to 25 May. So he could not convene the NPC to declare full martial law. Even when he returned to China on the 25th, he stopped in Shanghai and got sick, so he did not return to Beijing for several days. While in Shanghai, he was greeted by Jiang Zemin, who was the mayor of Shanghai and a member of the CCP Politburo, and others who tried to persuade him to take a stand against the student protesters. Wan also learned that his former ally, Zhao Ziyang, was a CCP general but had already essentially been ousted from power, and that Deng Xiaoping, who was the chairman of the Central Military Commission, or CMC, and basically the nominal head of the CCP and party elders, had planned to use military force to put an end to the protest. Wan, fully aware that he did not have the military power nor personal clout necessary to fight the decision regardless of his true political leanings, expressed support for the leadership on May 27th and specifically endorsed the provisions for martial law announced by conservative figures Premier Li Peng and President Yang Shangqun. Apart from asking his secretary to draft a memo clarifying his position, Wan did not make any further statements of support for the position of the leadership, suggesting that he may well have acquiesced to the decision rather than being earnestly in support of it. The day martial law was declared, thousands of military troops around Beijing also began moving to the center of the city. Although Premier Li expected the demonstrators to withdraw, the exact opposite happened. Thousands more people took to the streets and blocked the military vehicles from moving toward Tiananmen Square. They did not only stood in front of the vehicles, but they put up barricades. Early that day, Lonnie and I drove back to the intersection of the Fifth Ring Road and Fuxing Road, which became Chang'anjie, Tiananmen Square, where we had found dozens of military trucks lined up leading into the intersection and several command vehicles a few hundred yards in front of them. The demonstrators completely blocked the vehicles. Some of the students took megaphones and gave orders to the demonstrators to stay put. We spent the day walking around all of the trucks. The troops were either sitting in the trucks or standing or sitting outside. It's not clear if the soldiers were armed or not armed. However, most likely all of their weapons were on the floor in the trucks. There were no personal confrontations with the demonstrators. Of note, one of the command vehicles was a communications vehicle. Some of the demonstrators were sticking their head inside the window, so I did the same thing and was able to see the frequencies being used. It was very helpful. Lonnie and I used cash from my coup bag to rent a hotel room near the head of the convoy, but we were not able to actually see the vehicles from our room because of trees in the way. We spent the day walking around the trucks. We also drove nearby and found another group of trucks that had been blocked by demonstrators. We talked with demonstrators in each area to see what they knew about the troops. Some of them told us what the actual unit designators were. In addition, every vehicle had a military license plate number on it, which helped us identify the units. One of the key things that I remember the most was that while walking around the trucks, we heard the soldiers talking in Mongolian rather than Mandarin. The soldiers were also walking around and peeing in the bushes nearby. Since the units were not from Beijing, they were all using local tourist maps to figure out where they were. Finally, a real key issue is that all of the People's Armed Police, or PAP, and local police disappeared off the streets. The primary reason for this is that they were all locals and apparently did not want to confront their families and friends. During my time in Beijing, I subscribed to various PLA publications, including PLA Daily and the monthly PLA Pictorial Journal that were delivered to my apartment. I still have all of the issues from May until I left at the end of June, so it was helpful seeing what was signaling was being done at the time. The key is that both publications were published by the PLA's General Political Department. As can be seen in the photos on the slide, even though martial law had been declared, there were no confrontations between soldiers and demonstrators. Some of the demonstrators even brought over food for them. One of the key issues that almost all of the units were identified at the time were from outside Beijing. The primary reason for this, as noted earlier about the PAP and local police, was that almost all personnel and local units were from Beijing, so the local units were stood down. On Saturday, May 20th, PLA Army aviation helicopters dropped at least 2 different leaflets over the top of the demonstrators. I still have one of the original leaflets. The bottom line of the leaflets was that the PLA was the people's military and that the demonstrators should go home. As noted on the slide, the PLA stated that it was not there to suppress the demonstrators or take over academic institutions after the students returned to their campus. As you can see on this slide, the 4 questions were, first, 1 and 2, the PLA supports the CCP. Question 3, not there to suppress the students. Question 4, not there to occupy academic campuses. On May 20th, Lonnie and I spent the entire day walking around the trucks and searching nearby areas for other units, where we found one other unit. Needless to say, as foreigners, we sort of stuck out in the crowd. Close to midnight, it suddenly got very, very tense. As we were walking around the trucks, we heard the soldiers inside locking and cocking their weapons. Some students stood on the top of the various military trucks and announced over megaphones that the PLA had been given order to depart at 0200 to take over Tiananmen Square. Although the PLA expected the demonstrators to disappear, more demonstrators arrived to block the vehicle. Lonnie and I returned to our hotel room and used a payphone to call DAO, who immediately notified the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, who in turn notified the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For the next 2 hours, we remained in our room, looked out over the road in front of the convoy. We could tell that it was very, very tense. Needless to say, neither of us got any sleep. Although we expected the troops to start heading toward Tiananmen Square at 0200, nothing happened. We waited about an hour and still nothing happened. Finally, around 0300, we walked back down to where the trucks were and heard a demonstrator on the megaphone saying that the orders had been given to turn around and depart at 0800. We went back to our room and called DAO, who passed on that information. We then waited until around 0600 to go back down to the trucks. What we saw was that every truck had already been turned around. The situation was not tense. Soldiers were still peeing in the bushes and just hanging out near their trucks. Suddenly, at a few minutes before 0800, we saw various soldiers, probably squad leaders, standing outside each truck and ordering everybody to get in their vehicle. At exactly 0800, every vehicle departed into formation and headed west along Fuxing Road. We followed them and found out that all of the units in our area dispersed to either athletic stadiums or military facilities. Although I am sure of the multiple books about the Tiananmen crisis about this, I have not read them. However, it is my personal opinion that what happened was that someone at a particular level, perhaps the Beijing Military Region or MR commander, made the decision to take over Tiananmen Square, but he didn't clear it with higher authorities. When the higher authorities found this out, they overrode the decision and ordered the troops to leave. Of particular note, up to that time, the primary logistics support vehicles that were providing food and all logistics supplies to the troops were from the Beijing MR. But after martial law was declared, all the Beijing MR support vehicles disappeared, and all of the vehicles were directly subordinate to the PLA's General Logistics Department, which was headquartered in Beijing. Again, I think this was because the Beijing MR Logistics Department was also primarily manned by people who grew up in or near Beijing, called Beijingers. The situation between May 22nd and June 2nd is what I call the lull before the storm. Once the PLA troops withdrew, the DAT tasked each of our attachés to go to our specific AOR and see what we could find. Lonnie and I were able to find out where all the troops that we had identified earlier had deployed to. We talked with nearby demonstrators who asked them what their personal goals were. Almost all of them said they wanted to have a more democratic government like the US. Because all the police had disappeared, there was no one to manage traffic on the streets. Keep in mind that, at that time, almost no one owned a personal vehicle. Everyone rode bikes. However, there were bike lanes on every road, including Fuxing Road and Chang'anje. Because the police disappeared and there were still demonstrators, barricades all along many roads, the bicyclists literally took over the roads as shown in the top photo. As such, every housing compound had a group of older citizens who were called block monitors and wore appropriate armbands. They slowly started taking control of the streets and forcing people to move back into the bike lanes. In addition, people who needed to move supplies around by vehicle for work were getting tired of the blockades. As such, the streets were slowly opening up from the outside toward Tiananmen Square. The PLA Daily was sending mixed signals that shifted back and forth from the People's Army to martial law themes. To me, this indicated a lack of having a single guidance at the top levels. On May 27th, students of the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing erected the Goddess of Democracy statue outside Tiananmen Square next to Chang'anje. It took them 4 days to build it. It is my personal opinion that this event is what changed everything for the CCP leaders and caused them to make the decision to take over the square. Following the declaration of martial law, certain members of DAO Beijing met with our NATO allies to come up with a plan to work together to determine what was happening. As such, we spread out over the city and identified units and their locations. The U.S. Defense Liaison Office, or DLO in Hong Kong, also sent a couple of officers to DAO to help man the office 24/7 so that our attachés could spend more time on the streets. As noted earlier, our naval attaché was evacuated out of Shanghai following a car accident on May 20th and did not return until May 29th. The PLA Daily continued to send mixed messages after martial law was declared. The 26 May issue on the left was also about interacting with the PLA, while the 27 May issue on the right was a mix of dealing with the people and taking over all the media outlets. Although things had settled down somewhat since the troops withdrew on May 21st, we spent a little time each day driving around and checking out the situation. However, we were spending more time in the office each day. During the late afternoon on Friday, June 2nd, I was in my office and received an anonymous call from a Chinese person who told me that the PLA was going to move in and take over Tiananmen Square that night. I immediately passed this on to all of our other DAO attachés. We dispersed to our designated AOR to see what was happening. Ironically, the first thing we found was that it was pouring rain and there were almost no demonstrators on the street. As such, the PLA literally could have driven into the square unimpeded. In addition, there was already a large contingent of hundreds of troops inside the Great Hall of the People. They had arrived there through the underground tunnels in Beijing. Given that they did not take over the square that night, it is my personal opinion that the senior leader, specifically Deng Xiaoping, had already made the decision to conduct the assault starting after midnight on the 3rd. He wanted to send a message not only to the demonstrators, but also to the PLA that he was in charge and they would do what he told them to do. Given that nothing happened on Friday, it is my opinion that Saturday is what I call a made-for-video day that set the stage for the assault that began later that night. The reason I say this is because just about everything you see on this slide appeared on television starting on Monday evening as justification for the assault. Lonnie and I spent the entire day walking around outside the square and in western Beijing. At no time other than taking the photos on May 4th did we enter the square, since that was tasked to other people in the embassy. During the early morning, we observed a PLA lieutenant colonel verbally engaging with demonstrators outside the entrance of the western side of the Great Hall of the People. He was encouraging them to leave. Shortly thereafter, a little farther to the west from the Great Hall of the People, in a large parking area, we observed a PLA bus and 2 trucks stopped by demonstrators. The soldiers were all calm and, in my opinion, had been placed there so they could be videotaped as their vehicle was surrounded. The photo at the top shows some of their rifles and helmets that the demonstrators pulled out of the vehicles and placed on top of one of the buses. The photo was shown not only on TV starting on Monday, but also was in the August issue of the PLA Pictorial. In my opinion, there is a possibility that the demonstrators who removed the rifles and put them on top of the bus were also military personnel sent to do this on purpose so it could be videotaped. During the early evening, several hundred apparent conscripts were marching toward Tiananmen Square along Chang'an from the east, were blocked by demonstrators in front of the Beijing Hotel, which is directly across from the corner of the square. They were forced to turn around and leave. The crowd cheered as they left. This also showed up on the TV news multiple times starting on Monday. Of particular note, the only PLA Air Force units that were involved in any of this was the 15th Airborne Corps. All other PLA Air Force units in the area were grounded. One of the primary reasons for this was apparently that Deng Xiaoping still did not trust the PLA Air Force, especially given its activities during the Cultural Revolution. This map shows the locations where Lonnie and I were involved, starting in the evening of Saturday the 3rd and into the morning of Sunday the 4th. Around midnight on Saturday the 3rd, Lonnie and I drove out to our AOR in western Beijing to see what we could find. We found several hundred PLA trucks in a convoy near the intersection of the 5th Ring Road, just waiting for orders to do something. We also found some other PLA units in a nearby area. Each convoy was near the facilities we had located following the withdrawal on the day after martial law was declared. Of note, we did not take any photos during this time for concern that we might be stopped and searched. We also would have had to use a flash bulb, which would have drawn attention to us. We were definitely concerned about our own safety since we stuck out because of our embassy vehicle and our ethnicity. Around 0400, we arrived on the eastern side of the circle intersecting the 4th Ring Road and Fuxing Road. As we looked down toward Tiananmen Square, which was a few miles away, we saw nothing but burning vehicles, including military trucks. A bunch of demonstrators saw us and came over to us and said that they had not burned the vehicle, that the PLA is the one who burned their own vehicles. They also gave us several spent shells. While we were talking, we suddenly heard a commotion coming from the western side of the circle and looked up to see the PLA truck convoy that we had found earlier near the 5th Ring Road intersection coming around the circle. The demonstrators scrambled and we got in our vehicle and started driving north on 4th Ring Road. Fortunately for us, the convoy vehicles all came to the circle and followed the traffic route to the right. We don't know what would have happened if they had come and split and gone around both sides of the circle. We immediately drove up to the Shangri-La Hotel on 4th Ring Road to talk with the CNN reporters who were staying there and had set up their command post. Normally, DAO attachés were not allowed to talk with reporters, but the DAT had given us approval in May to have brief discussion with CNN if necessary. We ran into the command post and told them to contact any personnel who might be in Tiananmen Square and to tell them to get out immediately. We listened to them communicate by walkie-talkies. At 0420, one of the reporters said that the PLA had just entered the square. Of note, the Chinese activist Fang Lijie and his wife were also in the command post. They took refuge in Ambassador Lily's residence on June 5th and were granted asylum. They remained there until 25 June 1990, when they were allowed by Chinese authorities to leave the embassy and board a U.S. Air Force C-135 transport to Britain. After spending some time at Cambridge University and then Princeton, they moved to Tucson, Arizona, where he passed away in 2012. Of note, DAO's other assistant air attaché, Captain Danny Laver, was riding his bicycle near the square that night, and bullets were ricocheting around his bike. It appears that the assault was completed by the afternoon of the 4th. Over the next day, we saw a lot of burned PLA trucks, armored personnel carriers, and tanks along Fuxing Road in Chang'an. However, with only a couple of days, they had all been hauled away and placed in huge rubble piles, which we also saw. The CCP propaganda began almost immediately after the physical one. One key issue was that, prior to the assault on the square, we could talk with demonstrators at will. However, starting the next day, the media was partially blaming the U.S. for the situation and warning people not to talk with us. As such, no one would look at us or even talk to us. One of the key questions is how many people died that night. Although I originally saw reports indicating anywhere from 300 to 2,000, a BBC report from 2017 stated that up to 10,000 people died that night. Based on some discussions afterwards, it is my understanding that one key issue was that all of the demonstrators who died were cremated almost immediately. Their families had to pay a large sum of money for the crematorium to write on the official paperwork that they had died of natural causes, for fear that the families might be arrested. Based on interviews over the next few days, Lonnie and I were told that when the PLA occupied the square, that they divided the demonstrators into two distinct groups. One group was marched out of the southeastern part of the square, and a distinct group was marched out of the southwestern corner of the square. The second group was then marched up a small alley on the western side of the square and were gunned down by machine guns that had been set up in advance. Based on an interview with a person who actually saw this, one person tried to run and was run over by an APC. Although Lonnie and I tried to have access to the street for a couple of days, it was blocked off with concertina wire. Once it opened a couple of days later, we walked up that street and clearly saw bullet holes in the chest level in buildings along the street. There was little doubt in our minds but that this did occur. Concerning the status of the student leaders after the assault, according to Wikipedia, on June 13th, the Beijing Public Security Bureau released an order for the arrest of 21 students who they identified as leaders of the protest. These 21 most wanted student leaders were part of the Beijing Students' Autonomous Federation, which had been an instrumental student organization in the Tiananmen Square protests. Three prominent leaders who topped the list were Wang Dan, Urukaishi, and female Chai Ling. Immediately after the release of the list, only 7 out of the 21 most wanted escaped China, with assistance from the Hong Kong-based organization Operation Yellowbird. Wang Dan and Chai Ling currently live in the U.S. Urukaishi currently lives in Taiwan. Starting on Sunday evening the 4th, all news media stated that the demonstrators had instigated this and that the PLA was merely involved in order to protect itself. Of note, none of the news anchors ever looked at the screen. They merely read verbatim from a script they held in their hands. The 50-page issue of PLA Pictorial published in August has dozens of photos, including the one on the right in this slide, of a PLA enlisted soldier hanging from a vehicle, which have captions saying the PLA was merely protecting itself. The journal also has lots of photos of PLA meeting with young children who were cheering them on. I still have the original journal. The photo in the middle was taken by DO's air attaché, Colonel Larry Mitchell, showing the burned out vehicles on the 5th before they were hauled away and placed in the large piles. Since the assault basically lasted only a single day, DO was tasked to drive around and find everything we could about what units were involved and what the current situation was. Overall, we identified most, if not all, of the units involved, since each one set up a small command center and guards were posted on nearly every corner. Basically, troops from multiple locations, including the Shenyang, Jinan, Nanjing, Chengdu, and Lanzhou military regions, merely moved to locations in Beijing that equated to their location with China, as shown by the arrows on the map. Think of a map on the right that shows the 7 military regions just coming down on top of Beijing, such that those from Shenyang came into the northwest, Chengdu from the lower left. On Monday, June 5th, the PLA troops began driving multiple times around the U.S. Embassy. It appeared they were trying to intimidate personnel in the embassy. As such, the DAT ordered us to start shredding all of our documents in case the PLA assaulted the embassy. As such, we had to spend time in the office instead of being out on the streets. In addition, we only had one shredder that kept heating and shutting down. I had a 2-drawer safe with all of my material that had to be shredded. Ambassador Lilly was seriously considering an evacuation of all non-essential Americans. As part of this, Lonnie and I drove up to the PLA Air Force compound near the Great Wall and retrieved the 2 U.S. Air Force officers who had recently arrived to help manage the Peace Parole program. We took them back to the Sheraton Hotel where they spent the night. Shortly after the PLA's assault on Tiananmen, the Department of Defense and PLA mutually suspended the Peace Parole program, and the PLA recouped $100 million, but it took over 3 years before the 2 aircraft at Bethpage were shipped back to China. Following the 4 June Tiananmen crackdown, the U.S. suspended arms sales to China. However, Chinese technicians in the U.S. were allowed to resume work on the program a few months later until Beijing decided in May 1990 not to proceed beyond the development stage, and sent almost all the technicians home. President George Bush ordered all 4 FMS contracts to be terminated and all equipment returned to China prior to the inauguration of his successor, Bill Clinton, on 20 January 1992. The 2 J-82 prototypes and the mock-up were subsequently shipped back to China in January 1993, along with 4 ship sets of 80 avionics upgrade kits and the remaining technicians. A couple of days after the assault, Colonel Larry Mitchell was out doing a recon when he stopped at a PLA. He was stopped at a PLA barricade south of Tiananmen Square. He rolled down his window and showed his embassy ID card, which is called a carnet. The soldier, who put a rifle to his head, was apparently from Sichuan province and could not read the Chinese characters on the card. Colonel Mitchell talked his way out of the situation. Late each night, we sat in the skiff and called DOD to report the situation. One problem, however, was that the command center did not have a map of Beijing, so we had to spell out the name of every street and try to describe where they were located. The map on this slide shows where Tiananmen Square, the Zhengguomenwai housing facility, the U.S. Embassy, and the Workers' Stadium are located. The next major event took place on Wednesday, June 7th, when the PLA marched hundreds of young soldiers under guard out of Tiananmen Square down Chang'an toward the intersection of 3rd Ring Road, where the Zhengguomenwai diplomatic housing compound where diplomats from multiple countries live. The housing area was just outside of the intersection. Those personnel under guard were apparently soldiers who had deserted during the crisis. When the first PLA trucks arrived in front of Zhengguomenwai, a lead officer stepped out and pointed to the building, where the soldiers and the trucks opened fire at the compound. According to the PLA, they were protecting themselves against a sniper. As such, after opening fire, several PLA personnel then entered the compound, and according to an interview with an American living in the compound who saw all of this happen, the PLA then breached the compound, arrested a sniper, and marched him out in handcuffs. The sniper merely walked out as if nothing had happened. It was all a show. As I will discuss later, the PLA had also set up snipers across the street the day before, and they also opened fire on the compound. In my opinion, all of this was orchestrated to keep anyone in the compound from seeing the PLA marching their deserters down the street. I will discuss more about this later. Shortly after the shooting, the U.S. Embassy held an all-hands meeting and ordered an evacuation of all non-essential American diplomats and civilians. Ambassador Lilly tasked DAO Beijing to manage the evacuation, which took place on June 8th and 9th. The other ARMA, Major Larry Wurtzel, was placed in charge of the evacuation and drove the ambassador's armored car as the lead vehicle. Of note, no one had cell phones or email at the time, so it was difficult to contact American citizens in Beijing, many of whom had not registered with the embassy, even though they were supposed to have done that upon their arrival in China. On June 7th, a member of DLO Hong Kong arrived in Beijing to help and brought some walkie-talkies for us, but we were restricted from using them unless absolutely necessary. Following the ambassador's decision to evacuate, I immediately went to my apartment, which was a block from embassy and a block away from the Zhengguomenwai compound, took my wife and my 2 sons to the Sheraton Hotel to spend the night. They barely had any time to pack a couple of suitcases and left the breakfast on the table. United Airlines sent special aircraft to Beijing to evacuate everyone over the next couple of days. My family was evacuated the first day. I finally got to go home and clean up the breakfast dishes that were still on the table. Later that afternoon, Lonnie and I found about 10 American college students and spent the night in the Shangri-La Hotel with plans to take them to the airport the next day. However, the next morning they all decided not to leave. It was their choice, so we had no control over their decision. One key issue after the evacuation was when to allow the embassy personnel to come back. One of the driving forces was how to deal with children who needed to start school in the fall. The other factor was where families were living on a part-time basis in the U.S., either with family, friends, or a hotel. These were key factors that eventually led to opening up the embassy in August and allowing families to return. I was scheduled to pack out on the 19th, so I spent a few days getting everything ready, including my Honda. In all honesty, I never expected to see my household goods or my Honda ever again. However, they all arrived about a month later in perfect shape. One of my favorite stories, though, involves one of the U.S. Embassy civilian employees named Jack Law, who was a retired Navy Seabee and managed the embassy's facilities and helped with all housing issues. He also left at the same time that I did in June and was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan. While serving as an instructor in the Joint Military Attaché School for the next 3 years, I had the opportunity to visit my students who were assigned to just about every country in Asia. While in Islamabad, Jack told me that the Chinese came to his apartment in Zhengguomenwai, packed everything up meticulously in bubble wrap and boxes, and then put a crimp on the storage container. However, when his household goods arrived in Islamabad and he opened the container, Everything he owned had been smashed into itsy bitsy little pieces. He realized that the reason this happened was because he had allowed media personnel to use his apartment balcony to look out over the intersection of Jiangguomenwai and Third Ring Road. Since every apartment was bugged, they knew exactly what he had done. This was their way of telling him that they didn't approve of it. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent time writing up everything I needed to and evaluating the overall situation. Colonel Mitchell and I were in one of the first vehicles that was allowed to drive in front of Tiananmen Square, where he took this photo. Lonnie and I took the lead reporting on the shooting at the Jiangguomenwai housing compound. Our 5 primary sources were: 1, a video by CNN that took from the top of a large building between Tiananmen Square and Jiangguomenwai that showed the PLA marching their soldier out of the square toward Jiangguomenwai. CNN did not understand what they had seen. Second, a foreign military attaché who lived in Jiangguomenwai videotaped the entire situation from his balcony and allowed us to watch it. Third, based on a discussion Lonnie and I had with an American friend who worked across the street from Jiangguomenwai, we determined that the PLA had set up their own snipers across the street from the compound the day before. And fourth, on the morning of the shooting, one of our attachés got a call in his office from a PLA officer telling him that their meeting in his apartment in Jiangguomenwai was canceled. Ironically, no meeting was scheduled, but the officer was subtly warning him to be out of his apartment because it had been targeted. When the snipers across the street from Jiangguomenwai opened fire, his apartment was struck, which further confirmed that this was orchestrated the day before. Our full report was used as the base for a diplomatic démarche that the U.S. Embassy gave to the PRC Ministry of Foreign Affairs in late June, which the Chinese denied. In mid-June, the Washington Post used the report to provide detailed articles based on the available information. My successor, Major Kevin Lancet, arrived on June 4th, and I spent the next day with him explaining what the overall situation was and showing him around Beijing. His family was not allowed to come with him until school started. Normally, when any foreign attaché leaves China, the BMAC holds a going-away party. However, given the tumultuous situation at the time, no party was held for me. When Lonnie left a year later, the BMAC held a party, but the PLA told him he would never be allowed to return to China again. Ironically, we both returned to Beijing for the first time in 1998 and ran into each other at a conference. A lot has changed since 1989. For example, at that time there were only a couple of large buildings along Chang'an between Tiananmen Square and Jiangguomenwai. Today, the road is more like downtown New York with a lot of large office buildings and stores. As such, any similar demonstrations would disrupt their daily business. Second, the PRC has dramatically expanded the proportion of its college-age population able to attend college from about 8% in 1990 to 42.7% in 2017. In '89, high school and college graduates were told where they would work, they lived in the unit's housing, they didn't own a personal vehicle. Today, all of that has changed based on the shift to the more of a market economy. As such, people have much more personal freedoms than they did in '89. Today, even though the CCP has put limits on social media, just about everyone has a cell phone, computer, and social media account. They also have bank accounts, credit cards, and ATM cards. As noted earlier, at that time, the majority of the personnel in the PLA and PAP in Beijing were people who grew up in the area. That was also the case for the rest of China. Following the Tiananmen crisis, the PLA expanded the path so it could deal with internal issues like that, and it basically stopped allowing any personnel to serve in the city or even the province where they were born and raised. Since 1989, relations with the U.S. have gone up and down. For example, there were major demonstrations outside the American embassy in May 1999 after the U.S. military inadvertently bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia during Operation Allied Force. Supposedly, the PLA took the demonstrators to the embassy in buses and then took them back afterwards in order to control the situation. Finally, when I was in Beijing, the U.S. Embassy only had about 130 total personnel, including Chinese workers. The U.S. built a brand new embassy in 2008, which now has 1,300 total personnel.
Again, we'd like to give a special thanks to Ken Allen for that amazing brief from his time on the ground in 1989.